Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture for week 6, and today we're going to talk about uh, automobile accidents and their compensation, and we're going to cover three uh, chapters, uh, and we start from the simplest, which is chapter 6, where we're going to learn about interaction among liability rules, things like negligence and strict liability, and their interaction with risk allocation and insurance. So the starting point is on page 43, and the difference now between what we talked about earlier in relation to contracts is that there the parties were actually bargaining with each other. They knew each other, they sat down with each other, and they bargained the contract or the agreement. Here, of course, when you have an accident, you don't bargain. So bargaining will not lead to an efficient outcome, and the reason for that again is that the parties, the driver for example and the pedestrian, are not actually going to sit down and bargain how they're going to have their accident. Okay, but still you can devise efficient rules that basically relate to negligence and strict liability, and how those rules would give you the efficient outcome. So as usual, we're going to structure a simple example to illustrate how these things could work, and we're going to assume, as usual, start with that the parties are risk averse, and this basically means that they are happy to use the expected cost of the accident to the pedestrian. Of course, we know that there's benefit, and the benefit is certain to the driver. Okay, we're going to also assume that the driver's actions that affect the harm or the accident is simply their speed. So we're going to have three different speeds. So on the left hand side, the behavior of the driver is either to drive rapid or moderate or slow. The speed is rapid, moderate or slow, and based on that they would get a certain benefit. The benefit increases with speed, as does the expected cost to the pedestrian. As usual, under cost, what we will do is to look at the total net benefits. So it doesn't matter who's getting the benefit, who's getting the cost. What we want is simply to maximize the efficiency, so we want to get the maximum possible net benefits, and these are shown on the right hand side, the last column on right hand side, and this is the same table as table 3 on page 44. And as you can see here, the maximum net benefits occur where the driver uses moderate speed, and that gives them a benefit of 80 and an expected cost to the pedestrian of 40, and the difference is the highest among all three types of speeds. Okay, so now we know our efficient outcome. When we design our laws, basic negligence and strict liability, we want to see this outcome occur. We want to see the rules give incentives to these parties, the driver and the pedestrian, so that they still come to this efficient outcome. So we're going to look at two different rules. The first is strict liability and the second is negligence. Under strict liability, the driver is liable regardless of the level of care. So net benefits would be as it is in table 3. They're going to look at what they're going to look at what their net benefit is out of their actions, and the maximized net benefit would still be the efficient outcome, which is to drive moderately. So again, this is the strict liability rule. So the driver is liable for the accident regardless. Okay, so regardless of what their speed is, if an accident occurs, they would be held liable. So they would go through the rationale of what speed should I use, and they would come to the conclusion that the speed that would maximize their net benefits would be the one that they should use, because they want to maximize net benefits, and that would mean that they will have to drive at 40. Under strict liability, they pay the cost of the accident to the pedestrian regardless of their speed. Under negligence, there would be a standard of care. you have to have a standard of care. If you are below it, you breach it, and that means you have to pay compensation. So let's assume that the standard is to act efficiently. So we are going to impose the standard where the driver drives moderately. So that's what we want. So we put the standard there. So the driver would be liable only if they drive rapidly, if they breach the standard of care. Otherwise, if they drive moderately or slowly, they don't incur any costs, even if an accident occurs, that is. Alright, so you'll find now that under negligence, the efficient outcome is going to be a little bit different. Now you could see that the net benefit is going to be, this is the driver looking at it, so their net benefit. They're going to say, okay, if I drive rapidly, then I get 120, but I have to pay 100 in expected accident costs, so I'm left only with 20. However, because this is negligence and there's a standard of care, if I maintain that standard of care, I don't worry about any costs and I don't have to pay anything because I'm not liable. So if I drive moderately or I drive slowly, I get either 80 for driving moderately, but I pay 0, so my net benefit is 80, and if I drive slowly I get 50 and my net benefit again is 0. Why is it 0? Because I'm not breaching the standard of care, so I still get my net benefit of 50. Okay, so now you could see that the driver has the net benefit of 20, 80 or 50, and again you would see that they would choose the one that maximizes their net benefits, i.e. $80, and that again coincides with driving moderately. Okay. So in either case, under both rules, now we see that whether it's strict liability or negligence, you still are going to get $80. You're still going to get the efficient outcome regardless of whether you use strict liability or negligence. However, of course, in case of negligence, there's this added cost of having to determine the efficient outcome, being able to set the standard at the efficient outcome. Okay, so we're assuming basically that courts have enough info to determine the standard of care that corresponds to the efficient outcome. Alright, so as a general principle then, both strict liability and negligence are efficient, okay, provided first for strict liability that you set the liability equal to the actual damage. So when the driver is actually doing the calculations in their head basically of what should I do, they know that they are going to pay everything that the pedestrian is going to incur in costs or in actual damage. Second thing, for negligence, you need to make sure that the standard of care is set at the efficient outcome, in our example driving moderately, and that of course requires you to be able to identify that standard of care. Alright, now let's look at pedestrians care. Now let's look at this from the pedestrian's point of view. We are on page 48, table 4. Okay, now let's say that the pedestrian also has a decision to make. So before, it was only the driver that has a decision to make, which related to the speed at which they're going to drive. So we got the rapid speed or the moderate or the slow speed. Now we're going to also give the pedestrian a decision to make, and they could either walk or run. Okay. Now the benefits to the driver are exactly the same as before. We're not going to change that, but now we're going to assume that the pedestrian would get an extra benefit of $5 from running, okay, and that their accident costs are going to increase by $10 if they choose to run rather than walk. So the walking payoffs are exactly the same from the previous table. Now we're just going to add to them in the red column here, we're just going to add to them the dollar values for the costs of the accident if they were running. Okay, so now you could see that if the driver is driving rapidly, then the expected cost could be 100 if the pedestrian is walking, if they choose to walk, or 110 if they choose to run. And we then can proceed as before to calculate our net benefits, i.e. the efficiency, as we said. So the right hand side column is going to give us the values that you see there, and then you would ask yourself, what is the efficient outcome here? And you could see that regardless, so if you take for example the decision of the driver to walk, the decision of the pedestrian to walk, they would get 20 net benefit out of the rapid driving or the rapid speed, or 40 or 30. This is if they choose to walk. Now the maximum of those three values is 40, which coincides again with the driver driving moderately. And you do the same exercise if they choose to run, and again you would get 30 in relation to driving moderately. The trick, of course, here is what did we do? When we assume that the cost is going to increase when the pedestrian makes this decision between walking or running, you find that what happens here is that we assumed intentionally that the increases are going to be linear. Do you see that? We assume that we will increase the cost of this accident by $10 regardless of whether we are in the rapid zone or the moderate or the slow zone. But of course you could imagine that at the slow zone, for example, yes, maybe the accident cost is going to increase by $10, but when it goes to moderate, maybe that would, because of the force of the impact, that could actually mean that the costs of the accident could go up by more than $10. So the increase might not be linear, and that might change things a little bit. When it comes to calculating the efficient outcome. But for our purposes, we maintain everything as simple linear progression, linear increases, so we get these two efficient outcomes. All right. So what happens then under strict liability? Here, of course, the driver is going to drive moderately. As you imagine, they're going to make the same calculations we did in the previous example under table 3. Efficient only to driver, not to pedestrian, of course, can improve by introducing a defense of contributory negligence. So in order for us to make sure that the pedestrian is also going to do the efficient thing, so basically we're saying that the driver, regardless of whether the pedestrian is going to walk or run, as you can see, the outcomes are efficient only if the driver drives moderately. So they're going to drive moderately regardless of what the pedestrian is going to do. However, for the pedestrian, there's only one efficient outcome, which is to walk, because walking is going to maximize our efficiency, the overall efficiency. But to do so, you probably have to put something like a defense of a contributory negligence, which is of course not a complete defense, but it will give them that incentive to move from running to walking. So the standard of care will have to correspond to the efficient outcome, not contributory negligent if walks. So you say that you would be contributory, you would be found as contributing to your negligence or contributing to your harm if you run. So that would give enough incentive to the pedestrian to walk. What about negligence? Okay, again, we're going to set our standard of care at the moderate driving speed. So that means that the driver pays for the costs of the accident only if they drive rapidly, but if they drive moderately or slowly, there is no impact and they get their full benefit. You see that from the calculations in this table. Okay, so again, the general principle is that strict liability with contributory negligence and negligence with or without contributory negligence are efficient. Alright, let's then now make our example more complex, more real life. So let's add something we know as activity level, the activity level or the issue of activity level. So we want to now look at the extent to which the driver and the pedestrian are involved in their activity. So we're talking about frequencies. The problem now is how to induce appropriate care and engage in the activity to an appropriate extent. So now on page 51 of your textbook. Okay, so we're going to extend our example, the previous example, to include the number of miles driven. So how often do you drive? Alright. So now we are on table 5 on page 52. And what it says basically is the same behavior of the driver, but when we talk about the benefits and the costs, they're going to vary for both the driver and the pedestrian depending on how often they engage in their activity. So how often does the driver drive and how often does the pedestrian walk basically. So we start with either they drive a lot or drive a little, and drive a lot or drive a little at a certain speed, and the same thing with the expected cost to the pedestrian if they are walking a lot or walking a little, when the driver is driving rapidly or driving moderately or driving slowly. And the same thing as before, we can calculate our net benefits, and from that calculate our expected or rather calculate our efficient outcome. And we could see here that it would be to have the driver drive moderately again, while the level of activity is little for both. So both drive a little and both walk a little. All right. So driving under strict liability, driver drives moderately and only a little, while under negligence we assume as before that the driver is liable only if driving rapidly, and that means again that they would be driving moderately, but this would also allow the inefficient participation by the pedestrian, because now or by both really, because now instead of getting the efficient outcome of driving or engaging in these activities a little, now because of the negligence rule they would both be engaging in it a lot. So while they are still the driver is driving moderately and the driver is driving moderately and the pedestrian is walking with just one decision to walk now, but now they would be actually engaging a lot in these activities, and that's why we say it's an inefficient participation. Again, it's the level of activity that we are looking at in this part. The general rule then is that strict liability is efficient and negligence efficient only if the standard of care includes the injurer's or the driver's activity level. So you have to actually not just say that you drive moderately, so you are sort of liable only if you drive rapidly, but you should also say that you will be liable if you drive a lot, and then you would be able to induce the efficient outcome. And the same thing if you look at the victims or the pedestrians' care and activity levels. Now let's talk a little bit about administrative costs. The cost of resolving accident disputes, so the number of cases litigated and the cost of resolving each case. You'll find that negligence produces less litigation, so the discussion is on page 54, and the cost of resolving each case is higher under negligence. Excuse me, so one of these rules, which is negligence, would reduce the number of cases. That's great, but the cost of every case that then is going to be litigated is going to be higher. So under strict liability you'd have more cases but cheaper to litigate, while under negligence less cases but more expensive to litigate. Okay, so there's no really clear favorable or clearly or admin costs do not clearly favor either of these rules. All right, so let's then now move to chapter 7 in relation to risk bearing and insurance. All right, so let's get started on chapter 7. This is about risk bearing and insurance, and we're going to just vary a little bit what we have been talking about. We're going to assume parties still are risk neutral. It's going to change in the next chapter. So because they are risk neutral, they don't care about risk. Okay. In this chapter as well, we're going to assume that parties are risk averse, and we'll carry this assumption of risk averse into the next chapter, which is chapter 9. So in this chapter and the next chapter, we're assuming now that parties are risk averse. Because they are risk averse, they care about not just the expected value of the risk, but also the absolute magnitude of the risk. Okay, let's get to an example which is on page 58. Let's assume that you are an associate in a private law firm. So you have just graduated with a law degree and you started working for a law firm. Okay. This firm accepts cases on something called contingent fee basis. So if they win the case, they get the money or the fee. If they don't, they will not get any money. So they offer you the same thing. So they say to you, if we win this case, as far as your salary is concerned, you will receive $200,000. Okay? And there's 50% chance of winning. Okay? And so the offer that you will get is basically a salary of $200,000 if you win and zero if you lose. Would you accept a certain salary instead, or you're happy with this offer? So let's assume that you're going to accept, because you're risk averse, that you're going to accept instead a salary of $80,000 with certainty. So far so good? The firm is not offering you this certain salary, but you would rather have someone offer you such a salary rather than go through that offer of winning and losing. Of course, the expected value there of winning and losing is going to be 50%, so 0.5 times 200, that gives you 100,000 expected salary versus a certain salary of 80,000. Because you're risk averse, you would be happy still to get less money just because it is certain. Okay, so knowing that, then we have a business opportunity. What is that? I would come to you and say, I will give you then 90,000, not 80,000, 90,000 with certainty, okay, in return for a claim on the firm's offer. What does that mean? So I'll come to you and say, look, here's 90,000 with certainty as a salary for you, annual salary of 90,000. In return, I want to have a claim on that offer. So I want you to accept the offer from the law firm. So you'd go to and say to them, yes, I will accept your offer of 200,000 if I win and nothing if I lose. And I will cover you. I'm the person who's making this alternative offer of 90,000. I will cover you with this certain 90,000 regardless of the outcome. But if you win, then I will get the 100,000. I will get the 200,000, and if you lose, I will get the zero. You don't have to worry about that. You will always get the 90,000. Okay. Now assume there are a lot of people like this young associate that wants certainty. Assume there are 100 of these lawyers, young lawyers that will participate in the scheme. So the expected return now is the 200,000 times 50% chance for each one of them times 100 for the whole lot. So the cohort would give you a $10 million expected return. And what's the cost I'm going to put up to get that 10 million? The cost for me is going to be $9 million, 90,000 for each one of these 100 young lawyers. So my expected profit now is 1 million. All right. Now everyone is better off under this agreement. Because of that, we say that the agreement is efficient. And if this is a little bit difficult to understand, you can go back to the discussion of efficiency and equity in chapter 2 on page 7. There they talk about something called Pareto efficient, and you can understand why this would be an efficient agreement. So the partners in a law firm are the ones really that do this kind of scheme. So they guarantee your salary as a new associate, and they bear the risk of losing cases. Okay, and the discussion is on pages 58 and 59. So a risk-averse person would have been willing to accept the 80,000 certain pay for the expected pay of 100,000, and similarly, where there is a detrimental risk, the risk-averse person would be willing to pay more than the expected value of the risk just in order to avoid it. Okay. But there's something that's problematic with insurance generally, which is the problem of moral hazard. So in the example we just had, the associate will have less incentive to work hard now because they have a certain pay. And when they join the firm, because their pay is certain, that becomes less incentive for them to work hard. So this is what we call the problem of moral hazard, and this could be tackled by increasing the insurance premium. Okay, but it's also not cheap to monitor. So there are other alternatives of things like partial insurance, okay, and co-insurance. So these things are discussed on page 60. So on pages 60, 61, the alternatives are discussed on page 61. Partial insurance means that you would have an excess, so you'd pay the first amount, say of $100, before you are eligible for the insurance. And the same thing with co-insurance, you would bear a certain percentage of the losses, and the rest then is covered by the insurance. All of this is why? Because to make sure that you have a vested interest not to bear any loss, because you will have to pay that amount associated with the loss. Okay. Let's then move to chapter 9. In this chapter, as we said, we're going to continue with the assumption of risk averse. So the parties are going to be assumed to be risk averse. Okay. Before, of course, in chapter 6, we said that the pedestrian and the driver were risk neutral, and we did the calculations based on that assumption. We're going to relax that assumption now and say that the parties are risk averse. And the starting point is pretty much the table that we saw on page 44. It's going to be reproduced now on page 72 as table 7. It's exactly the same table as before, but now in the red column you can see that we explain where the numbers came from. So the expected cost was simply a probability times the times the total loss. So the total loss here is 10,000. Okay, the loss if this accident occurs is 10,000, but then there's a probability of its occurrence, and the probability, as you can see, jumps up by the amounts you see in front of you. It is 1 over 500 if you drive slowly, so it's very low probability. It jumps to 1 over 250 if you drive moderately, and then it jumps again to 1 over 100 if you drive rapidly. Okay. And for the time being, assume that private insurance is not available to either of the parties, the driver and the pedestrians. And the pedestrian, and we're going to ask ourselves which one of the rules, strict liability versus negligence, is a more efficient rule to adopt. So let's start on page 73 with strict liability. So here the pedestrian is in effect insured. Why? Because the rule requires the driver to compensate the pedestrian for the full 10,000 loss, regardless of what the driver is doing. So the driver now bears the full risk of the accident. Okay, but they are risk averse, right? The same thing under negligence. If the driver does not breach the standard of care, then they would be not liable, and the pedestrian now bears the full risk. Okay. So if the pedestrian is risk averse, which one of these rules they are gonna prefer? They're gonna prefer the strict liability rule, because under that rule they are insured, and all of the risk is borne by the driver. And vice versa, if the driver is risk averse, they would prefer the negligence rule, because if they drive moderately or slowly, they are basically insured, and all the risk is borne by the pedestrian. So what about now if they are both risk averse? Then they will have to share the risk, and that could be done by modifying the strict liability rule by setting liability less than the actual loss. Remember, we said that for strict liability to be efficient previously, you have to set the liability equal to the actual loss. But now, because we have varied this assumption of risk neutral and made it risk averse, and because both parties are now risk averse, you would need to have this liability reduced so that you can shift some of the risk back on the pedestrian. So some of the risk is now with the pedestrian. The disadvantage, of course, is the driver is now going to take less than efficient care, because they know that some of the risk is going to be borne by the pedestrian. And there's an example on page 74. Now let's assume there are ways of maybe insuring the parties. So let's say that we assume that there is ideal insurance, so full coverage, and the premium is simply equal to the expected losses. Okay, and the liability insurance to the driver. So the driver has liability insurance, and first party accident insurance to the pedestrian. So everybody's insured and they are risk averse, so that's nice to them. That's what they want. If it's strict liability that we're gonna design the legal system to impose, the pedestrian then doesn't need insurance because already insured. Just like we said previously, under strict liability, all the risk is borne by the driver, so that the pedestrian doesn't need to be insured. For the driver, the premium is going to be equal to the expected accident cost to the pedestrian. So this is the red column that we see in front of us, the expected cost being the probability of the accident times the loss. So the driver chooses to drive moderately because if he drives rapidly, there would be a $60 increase in cost but only $40 increase in profit. And if the driver chooses to drive slowly, they get $30 reduction benefit, but the premium is lowered only by $20. So whether you go up or down, you'll find that the best outcome for the driver is to drive moderately. Now what about negligence? Okay, here the driver needs insurance only and only if they're driving rapidly. That's when they come under the breach, basically the standard of care. The premium is equal to the expected accident cost at that point, which is equal to 100. So we go back to our diagram, our table, and we see that if you drive rapidly, the expected cost is 100, so the premium would be set at 100. But the extra benefit, so you have to pay that much, right, in terms of premium to cover yourself against the loss. So again, you would compare that to the extra benefit to see your net benefit. The extra benefit is less, so it's only $40, so the driver would tend to drive moderately rather than pay the premium. Alright, so the pedestrian now will need insurance, first party insurance with full coverage, meaning that they will have to pay a premium of $40. And this rule is efficient with respect to care exercised and the removal of risk. Alright. So the 40 comes from this point here, where you have the driver not driving above moderate because they know that they are under negligence, so they stay under that, they drive moderately, and that means that the driver the pedestrian rather would have to pay the premium of $40, which is equal to the expected cost. Alright, now let's talk about imperfect insurance. So we've talked about ideal insurance. It's non-realistic, this ideal insurance, because difficult to monitor, and hence the premium is not going to correspond to the behavior of the parties. So not adequate incentive to take precautions, again going back to the problem of moral hazard. So we assume we are faced with imperfect insurance due to moral hazard. Now, under strict liability, the driver still doesn't have adequate incentives to take precautions that reduce the expected losses. Under negligence, the driver wants insurance only if driving rapidly, but the premium gain is greater than the benefit. The driver hence drives moderately, and the same outcome we got from ideal insurance. The pedestrian will want to obtain first party insurance with full coverage again, but no reason to deny full coverage because there is no moral hazard. How come? The pedestrian cannot affect the probability of magnitude of the loss because we assumed that. So by assumption we said the pedestrian cannot do something to change the magnitude of the loss, so there is no moral hazard. And the general rule then is where moral hazard with respect to driver but not the pedestrian, negligence is preferred to strict liability. So negligence means that it is the pedestrian that would need to get some form of insurance, provided that the driver is going to drive below or will not breach the standard of care. So in summary, if the insurance is not available, strict liability is preferred when pedestrian is risk averse and the driver is risk neutral, and negligence is preferred when driver is risk averse and the pedestrian is risk neutral, so the reverse. And you can see because under strict liability the pedestrian is risk averse, so if they are risk averse they would be protected, basically insured under strict liability, And under negligence, if the driver is the one who's risk averse, they would be insured by not exceeding or by not breaching the standard of care. If they are both risk averse, we have to modify strict liability so that the pedestrian would share some of the loss, but that would create a moral hazard problem because now the driver will take little or less care. If we assume unrealistically that ideal insurance is available, then both strict liability and negligence are efficient. But we know that ideal insurance is not available, so under imperfect insurance, if imperfect insurance is available to the driver, okay, because of moral hazard, but perfect insurance is available to the pedestrian because there is no moral hazard, then you'll find that negligent is efficient and strict liability is not efficient. Okay, that ends our discussion for this week, and I'll be talking to you again soon.